What's the real story? How did all of this come to be? Was it all by chance, or did something or someone design everything? Join us as we learn from our host, William Henry, and discover that the story of the Earth and our universe is really his story.
Welcome to another installment of Discovering His Story, a production of Youngstown Christian Television. We are in the process of going through the history of the ancient world. Our purpose in this is to show how the Bible is integrated with the secular history around, and to not only see how the biblical characters had an effect upon those that we know in secular history, but also to give us an assurance of the reliability of the Scriptures as they tell us about these characters. And the Bible records real history, which means also that all of history is accomplishing God's purposes, His plans, and therefore it is His story. We've been looking at the ancient time period, and particularly the Empire of Persia. The last time we were together, we were looking at Darius the Great, who established a great empire for Persia. As you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, all the way over into part of what we call Greece today. He conquered Thrace, but he was unsuccessful at conquering the Greek civilization, as his army was soundly defeated by the Greeks, who were outnumbered 2-1 on the plain called Marathon. Now, at the same time that this was going on, just to give you an idea of what's happening in other parts of the world, this is when Gautama Buddha lived in India. So the founder of Buddhism was alive during this time period. Well, let's go to the next king following Darius II, and his name was Xerxes, sometimes called Xerxes the Great. He became king when his father Darius died of old age, which is something unusual in the ancient world for kings. His mother was also of royalty, being the daughter of Cyrus the Great, whom we talked about in a previous episode. Now, Xerxes in the Old Testament has a different name, and this is one of the names by which he is called, and that's Ahasuerus. Now, Xerxes was a tall and vigorous man, and by royal consent, the handsomest man in his empire. But he was also violent, temperamental, and lustful. He had many mistresses. At this time, there were still a great many Jews living in Persia. As you might remember, they were given permission by Cyrus the Great to return to the land of Israel and to go back to Jerusalem. But many of them had not taken advantage of that and remained in the land with others that were still there from other nations as well. And the reason for them staying is probably because they enjoyed lives of considerable culture and prosperity. It's in that context that we have the story of Esther. The book of Esther is a book in the Old Testament that recounts what occurred in the situation where a lot of Jews were still living in Persia under King Xerxes. Now, we're not going to go through all the details of the book of Esther. I highly recommend you reading that book for yourself. But I want to touch upon a couple of the things that relate to history and the effects of the biblical characters on history and vice versa. In 483, a fantastic feast attended by thousands of his kingdom officials coming from every one of the 127 provinces stretching from India to Ethiopia was given by King Xerxes. And it lasted, now I don't know about any parties you've been to. Most parties that I've been to in my life lasted a couple of hours. Maybe at some point you go on a family retreat that lasts a couple of days. This feast by Xerxes lasted, wait for it, 180 days. Can you imagine a party lasting that long? Well, I guess it had to be worthwhile to gather all these officials from all over the Persian Empire. But it might also be that this was in relationship to Xerxes planning his own invasion of Greece, and he's trying to gather popular support among his officials. I'm not sure exactly the timing of this, but it seems to me that it fits that very well. So he wanted to boost morale with the coming expedition against Greece. During the final week of the feasting, and you can imagine you're feasting, you're eating and drinking for that long. You get to the final week, and the king decided that's a good time to call for his wife, Queen Vashti. Now, she is called Amestris in the Persian Chronicles. And so he called on her to come in and parade her beauty before some of his important but half-drunk friends. Well, the king refused to display herself in this cheap manner. Angry, Xerxes took the advice of his friends and deposed her. And he said, "Look, king, if you let your wife get away with this, our wives are going to try to do the same thing and not be obedient and servile to us, so you've got to do something about it, lest this plague spread throughout the empire." Well, Josephus and other Jewish commentaries suggest that one of the reasons why she refused to come in and parade before these officials was that she was supposed to come with only her crown. So that may have been a good reason for her to refuse. But anyway, he deposed her as a result of that. Now, you might have sympathy for Vashti, and in this particular case, it might be warranted. However, there's something more you should know about her. Herodotus, that Greek historian, describes Amestris, as he calls her, as a cruel despot. He says, "I am informed that Amestris, the wife of Xerxes, when she had grown old, made return for her own life to the god who is said to be beneath the earth by burying twice 7 children of Persians who were men of renown." So she buried 14 children as a sacrifice to her gods. Well, in lieu of the queen being deposed, the king now is in the market for a new queen. And so an empire-wide beauty contest was held for 4 years to select a replacement that ultimately culminated in the choice of Esther. And again, read the book of Esther. You'll find out the details of how that occurred. So Esther has become queen. Now, in 480, Xerxes intended to lead an army of over 1.5 million men and 300 ships across the Dardanelles, or called the Hellespont, into Greece. As his soldiers, as this retinue was passing by on their way, and he was watching this dazzling display of his smartly marching armies, all carrying their brightly colored flags and banners, Xerxes wept. And this is so profound. When asked why he wept, the king replied, "Because I know all this military glory is but for a moment and will soon fade away forever. Because in much less than 100 years from now, every man present here today will have died, myself included." Wow, such wisdom in such a man that was also capricious and violent. Well, disaster soon struck, for he lost 400 ships in a severe spring storm at sea. In blind frustration and anger, Xerxes had people beat upon the stormy waters with his belt. He was so mad at the sea for going against him. Well, in order to safely transport his troops, though, Xerxes hit upon a great idea of building a pontoon bridge with his boats, such as in the drawing here. Now, in order to transport his horses without them being alarmed at walking on boards over ships, the sides were built up so they could not see the water around them, and dirt was layered over the planks of wood which stretched over the tops of the boats. And so there was dirt on the floor, walls up the side, and the horses didn't realize that they were not on dry ground. Upon landing in Greece, Xerxes' army traveled through Thrace and Macedon on the way to engage with the main Greek cities to the south. In order to arrive at the destination, it was necessary for Xerxes to proceed through a mountainous pass called Thermopylae. If you look on the map there, you can see the progress from Sardis over in Turkey, across the Dardanelles, through Thrace, over to Macedon, or they pronounce it Macedon, and then down through Greece towards the cities of Greece, which would include Thebes, Athens, and Sparta, and so on. Well, on the way, they had to go through a place called Thermopylae. There, his proud Persian troops were stopped for an entire day. Here, a Greek captain named Leonidas and his 300 brave Spartans held back the entire invading army for 24 hours, inflicting great losses on them. But this allowed the much smaller Greek army to carry out an orderly retreat to safety, where they were able to marshal a larger army to resist the Persians further south. A Greek trader informed Xerxes of a pathway around the pass that would enable the Persians to replace soldiers on both sides of the defending Spartans. And so all the Spartans were slain. Now, it's interesting, as I traveled to Thermopylae, it was not as I envisioned. I envisioned a pass through the mountains on either side. But this in reality is mountain on one side and the water on the other. So the narrow pass was the land that was near the water, but it was narrow because of the existence of the mountains there, and you can see in the picture. This is a picture of the monument dedicated to the 700 who died at the Battle of Thermopylae, and there was also a model there of Leonidas. This particular monument then is the full picture of the monument that is at that place. Well, Xerxes eventually made his way south after killing all the Spartans that had tried to defend Thermopylae, and he ended up burning Athens to the ground. But most of its citizens had escaped to the island of Salamis, or Salamis. You can see it in the map here. To the left is Salamis. To the right, off the picture, is Athens. And so they went out to this island and thought that they were better protected there. Xerxes then set sail for this island, confident of victory, because he outnumbered them 3-1 in his ships. But the smaller and swifter Greek fighting boats had mastered the art of ramming. Soon, before his horrified eyes, Xerxes, who was sitting atop a mountain watching down on the battle, viewed the slaughter of his proud navy. He left for Persia a defeated man. The remaining troops of 100,000 were put under the command of General Mardonius, which 1 year later was completely crushed and Mardonius killed in a pitched battle at Plataea. At this, the Persian Empire was dealt the final death blow. In 479, upon his return, Xerxes threw another party, in part to compensate for his defeat and also to celebrate his marriage to Esther. As a part of trying to ingratiate the people to himself, he also lowered taxes. It's at this time that a man called Haman arrives on the scene. We don't know where he comes from exactly, how he got into position that he did, but we're told in the book of Esther that he is an official in Xerxes' government. And for reasons you'll have to find in the book of Esther, he desired to exterminate the Jews, especially a man named Mordecai, who was possibly the uncle of Esther. Now, we do know that Haman was an Amalekite, meaning he was a descendant of King Agag, which we find in 1 Samuel 15, and he's the king that Saul had been commanded to execute. Do you remember when Saul was told by Yahweh to eliminate the Amalekites, to kill every person, and not only that, but all the animals, and he failed to do that? He kept the king, he kept some of the animals, and as Samuel the prophet came to him, he said, why am I hearing sheep bleating? And why is this king standing here? and King Saul made up all kinds of excuses, which were not legitimate. He said, it wasn't my fault, it was the people. And so Samuel had to step in and killed the king himself. But in the interim, some of the king's family had escaped. The damage had been done. And this son would then be the ancestor of Haman the Agagite. And the drama would play out again. That is, a descendant of Saul versus a descendant of Agag. Only this time, Haman was in a position of authority, and Mordecai, a descendant of King Saul's tribe, was in a position of prey. And so we find here that Haman is an Agagite, the posterity of Agag. And here we have verses that tell us about Saul being a Benjamite, and then there's Agag, and then Mordecai being a descendant of the Benjamites, the son of Kish, which was the family of Saul, and Haman being an Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews. My friend Robert Cruikshank Jr., in a series of articles that you can find online, demonstrates that Haman was indeed the fulfillment of the prophecy of Ezekiel concerning Gog, because Gog comes from Agag. I look up the articles, and you'll be amazed at the information that he has there. In the end, the Jews were delivered through the bravery of Queen Esther, and Haman and his sons were impaled upon the stakes intended for Mordecai. This is a painting of that impalement by Michelangelo as a part of what he painted in the Sistine Chapel. The deliverance of the Jews has been commemorated in the new celebration of Purim, or Purim, ever since. If you ever get a chance to go to a Purim celebration, it is a hoot. Typically, they reenact the story of Esther and pass out noisemakers and all kinds of things to indicate their pleasure at Mordecai and their displeasure with hooting and hisses and boos at Haman. It's a fun thing. And that is still celebrated by Jewish people today. All right, at the same time, we have a guy by the name of Confucius. I think you've heard of him. He died around 479 BC. The political intrigue, sexual licentiousness, and violent barbarity of Xerxes' court also fits the story of Esther. Xerxes commanded the construction of a building which has been designated the harem by archaeologists, because of the duplication of identical rooms in a row. To fund his many building projects, he raised taxes to a level that made him unpopular with his subjects. This general lack of restraint led to his downfall. Around 478 BC, which seems to be after the invasion of Greece in 480, Xerxes' fondness for women led to his pursuit of his brother Meciste's wife. His brother's name was Meciste's. When she refused him, he married one of his sons, called Darius, to the daughter of Meciste's, Artayante, who would be Darius's cousin, in hopes that by this union he could get closer to his brother's wife and manage to seduce her. When he saw Artayante, the woman who married his son Darius, however, he desired her more than her mother. And when he approached her, she agreed to an affair. Herodotus reports that at about the same time, Xerxes' wife, Amestris, had woven him a beautiful shawl, which he liked so much he wore it everywhere. Artayante admired the shawl, and one day when Xerxes told her that he would give her any gift she asked for, she requested the shawl. He tried to get her to take any other gift instead because he knew that should he give his mistress the shawl, his wife would discover it. He had given his word, however, and Artayante refused any other gift, and so he gave her the shawl. As he feared, Amestris heard that Xerxes' mistress was wearing the shawl and plotted revenge. When Amestris found out, she did not seek revenge against Artayante, the mistress, but against her mother, Meciste's wife, as Amestris thought that it was her connivance that brought this about. At the royal banquet on Xerxes' birthday, known as Tukta, at which the king granted gifts to his subjects, Amestris asked for his guards to deliver to her Meciste's wife. As with Artayante and the shawl, Xerxes pleaded with Amestris not to make any other request, but she would not do so. Xerxes then gave his brother's wife, Artayante, to Amestris. According to Herodotus, she sent for Xerxes' personal guards and with their help mutilated Meciste's wife. She cut off her breasts and threw them to the dogs, cut off her nose, ears, lips, and tongue, and then sent her back home totally disfigured. That's the woman, remember, who wouldn't parade in front of the officials. In response, Meciste's tried to raise a revolt in Bactria, the northern region, but Xerxes, hearing of his plans, trapped him and killed him, his sons, and all of the men he had rallied to his cause. Xerxes then returned to his building projects and designs for grander monuments to commemorate his reign and distinguish him from his father. So that's a little insight into the man Xerxes and his wife prior to Esther. His development plans were cut short through his assassination by his minister Artabanus, which was a different man than his uncle of the same name, who also murdered his son Darius. Xerxes' other son, Artaxerxes I, then killed Artabanus, took the throne, and went on to complete Xerxes' grand building plans in his own name and for his own greater glory. So Xerxes was assassinated by a courtier, possibly at the instigation of Artaxerxes. Then the courtier was murdered by Artaxerxes I. So Artaxerxes becomes king in 465. He's also has the name Artahashata, excuse me, and but in the Old Testament he's known as Artaxerxes. He's a handsome and, unlike his father, good-natured person. He's generous, wonder whether living with Esther maybe had an effect on him. But at this point, another person that we know from the Bible comes on the scene. His name is Nehemiah. Nehemiah was the cupbearer to Artaxerxes, and he lived in what was then the capital in the city of Susa. Now the cupbearer was not just somebody who carried the cup of wine into the king. A cupbearer had large responsibilities. The cupbearer also had authority to admit or deny persons to see the king, even the royal family. So the cupbearer was entrusted with a great responsibility, not only to make sure that the food and wine were safe, but also to be kind of a secret service for the king, determining who could get in and who would not be allowed in to see the king. In 458, as a result of what we see in the book of Nehemiah, which you can read, Artaxerxes allows the second return of people to Jerusalem under Ezra. We find that in Ezra 7 to 10. And his purpose is to restore and build Jerusalem, particularly the temple. Those chapters speak of establishing local law and order, as well as rebuilding the ruins of the temple and the wall. This decree of Artaxerxes is given to us in Ezra 7, 11 through 26, and in Ezra 9, 9. This is part of a series of returns following the deportations. So there were 3 deportations that we found under King Nebuchadnezzar, and now under the Persian rule, first under Cyrus, now under Xerxes, we have the return under Zerubbabel, and then the return under Ezra, and there will be a subsequent return under Nehemiah. So there will be 3 returns, and it will actually be under 3 different kings. Ezra, as you probably know, is a priest. He is a skilled scribe as well. Before his return, he was a secretary. After his return, he was a teacher of the law. And so Ezra goes back to the land, oversees the building of the temple, is concerned with teaching God's people the law of God that they possibly had not heard for a long time. And reform took place in the land. But Ezra found that the people who were living there had intermarried with non-Jewish people around. And so in Ezra 9 and 10, he goes against this and tells the people they need to consecrate themselves wholly to God, to get rid of these foreign wives, and to only marry their fellow Jewish people. So Ezra is there for a time of returning to the land, of rebuilding the temple, but most importantly, to bring revival to the people of Israel as they are coming to Jerusalem. At the same time, in Rome, we have the famous story of Cincinnatus, that benevolent dictator who was a farmer and who the Romans prevailed upon to come and lead them. Now, there's going to be a third return yet that we're going to find under the Persians, and that's going to be under Nehemiah. As you remember the story of Nehemiah looking sad before the king, Artaxerxes then allowed him to return to the land to rebuild the wall of Jerusalem. And as we come to that point in our narrative, we will pause and we'll see some of the things that happen with Nehemiah as he comes back to Jerusalem to rebuild the wall. Next time on Discovering His Story.
What's the real story? How did all of this come to be? Was it all by chance, or did something or someone design everything? Join us as we learn from our host, William Henry, and discover that the story of the earth and our universe is really his story.